So here I am again to talk to you about athletic footwear. Sometimes I kind of wish I could talk about other things, because I can tell you I'm a bit over barefoot minimalist, but we're not going to talk too much about that today. I think maybe it was Trish who gave me the brief to talk about athletic footwear past, present and future in 20 minutes, which I can tell you there's no one in the world I can do, but I'm going to have a bit of a crack at covering the eras that we've dealt with. I do just want to disclose that I do work for ASICS, and I also want to tell you that if you're at all interested, you can get more of this presentation on my website. So when I was putting this together, I was having a bit of a think about 50 years of SMA and what was going on back then, and being a car nut. You know, I was interested in things like this car, the Corvette Stingray, which was introduced in 1963. Absolutely beautiful looking car that handled like a suet pudding. Britain was gripped with a bunch of mods who were rolling around in Vespers, and inarguably the world's most beautiful car, the Mura S, was introduced to the world in 1963. These guys made their first hit record. I'm not sure how they did after that, but apparently they were quite popular. Across the road in London, mothers were locking up their daughters because the Rolling Stones hit town. And across the Atlantic, Bob Dylan cut his second record called The Freewheeling Bob Dylan at the age of 22. Martin Luther had his dream in 1963. Our Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, was pretending to be a member of the British aristocracy. JFK became the 35th President of the USA in 1963. That didn't last too long. And Lyndon B. Johnson became the 36th President in that same year. We had to talk about footwear. So in terms of footwear, there's quite interesting progression here. You can see that in 1952, this is a tennis shoe, and it was all very simple. This is the world's first marathon shoe. I always like to say I'm personally very grateful that underwear aren't designed this way, but this is called a tabi-toe shoe, and this is a picture of a Japanese runner actually winning the Boston Marathon in this shoe in 1964. If we have a look at the progression here, you can see that not a lot happened until maybe 1972. This is a shoe called the Marathon Fukuoka. It's a very famous shoe because it was worn by a very famous athlete called Derek Clayton, and he was the first man who broke 2 hours and 10 minutes in the marathon. He did this on the 3rd of December 1967 in this shoe. A year later, he went better. He set a record of 2 hours, 8 minutes and 32 seconds, and that was a record that stood for 12 years. He's a much underrated great Australian athlete. Alrighty, so that's where we were. Having a look at some of the most important shoes, I think, historically, this is a very interesting shoe. This is called the New Balance Trackster from 1960. It was probably the first purpose-built shoe for running. That was the first time we actually had a shoe that was designed specifically for runners. It's very interesting to me and very topical for what we're seeing now in terms of advertising. Back in 1960, this shoe was advertised as being the shoe you needed to have if you had shin splints. Nothing's got any better. There are still shoes that are being advertised saying you will achieve this result injury-wise if you wear our shoe. And unfortunately, there's very little basis to that. This is a very interesting shoe. I actually own a pair of these shoes. Very unique. This is a shoe called the E.B. Lydiard Marathon. It's named after Arthur Lydiard, the great coach from New Zealand. It was a one-piece kangaroo leather upper. It was extraordinary in that it was double the price of any other shoe on the market, therefore it did very poorly. But technically it was quite interesting. It was a German-built shoe, and you can see here that the weight's coming down a little bit with this shoe. The final shoe I want to show you is Onitsuka Tiger Jayhawk. It's named after the Kansas Jayhawks athletic team in the USA. Arguably, it's probably the shoe that's won more races than any other in the history of athletic footwear. You can see it was very light, and it's starting to look a lot like what we might expect a modern racing flat to look. So quite an interesting shoe, weighing in at 7.3 ounces. So that's a snapshot of the history. What are we dealing with now? Well, this is the 2013 Reebok ATV 19. This is a modern running shoe. This is been called the most repulsive shoe in the history of footwear, and it's very hard to disagree with that. And doing a little bit of research, I'm pretty sure that they are based out of this creature. This is called a water bear, and this little sucker can live in formaldehyde for many months, and you can pull him out and he'll still be alive. but if you have a look at the resemblance, it's quite startling, isn't it? This is being propagated as a running shoe, and it's being marketed by a washed-up mixed martial art performer. So look, the question that I've got about something like that is why? Why are we doing that? Is there any benefit for us and for our athletes? Are they going to derive a benefit? So I want to explore a little bit now of where we are. So I'm going to include the present as being the last 4 years, because we've seen this extraordinary phenomenon, an extraordinary change in the industry where we're being told that to go running barefoot or to run in very minimalist footwear is going to have major health benefits and give you a totally different experience. Now, I'm not here to say whether that's right or wrong. That argument doesn't offend me. What does offend me is the manipulation of the science. So we're going to explore that a little bit. So the present, well, this is what we've been looking at, things like Vibram 5 Fingers. There's a whole lot of different shoes that have come onto the market that are claiming various health benefits. And as a result of that, all of these particular companies are currently being sued. I believe this is the lady that's doing it. This is Sue Yu. And her associate, Mr. Kim Yu-suk. So there is a reason why companies are getting sued, and the reason they're getting sued is because they're making claims that they cannot substantiate. Okay, so we've got to be very, very aware of what's being said, and then we've got to amortise it to the current research and try to figure out what's what. So these are the assumptions that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with assumptions that zero drop will enforce a midfoot or forefoot strike. Now, for those of you that don't understand what the zero drop is, it simply means that there is a zero gradient between the heel and the forefoot. So it may be that you've got a shoe that has a 20mm platform under the heel and a 20mm platform under the forefoot. That's zero drop. It could also be 0 under the heel and 0 under the forefoot. In the case of the Vibram 5 Fingers, it's a couple of millimetres, but the net gradient is 0. Okay, so we've been told that if you run in this shoe, then you're going to have some benefits, and it's going to make you run, and force you to run on either your midfoot or your forefoot. It's also the next best thing to barefoot, and there is a major problem there because it's making an assumption that barefoot is the best way to run, and there is zero evidence for that. What we're being told is that if you run barefoot, it's a back to prehistoric man experience. However, I always put forward the argument saying that no caveman lived beyond the age of 40. They probably got injured running barefoot, rounded up by a tiger and eaten. So I could make a strong case for that as well. Also, the assumption is that midfoot or forefoot running will reduce injury. Now, this is a huge leap of faith, and this is what we're interested in here. We're all interested in clinical sports medicine. So this is the one we've got to apply the blowtorch for. Is there any evidence to say that minimalist footwear or running barefoot will reduce injury? Is there any evidence to say that running in a traditional shoe is going to reduce injury? I can tell you right now the answer is that there is zero evidence in either way, but we're going to talk about it a bit. Finally, there is the assumption that there is a perfect way to run, and that this is called good form. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly discuss some of these issues. Let's talk about zero drop first of all. Well, zero drop, does it really enforce a midfoot or forefoot running pattern? In other words, if you go to a zero drop shoe or run barefoot, will you automatically run on your midfoot or your forefoot? Now, a lot of you will have read research coming out of Harvard with Daniel Liebman, who's an evolutionary biologist. He wrote a very famous article that was published in Nature in 2010, and he put forward the argument that you cannot run barefoot unless you run on your forefoot because the impact on the heel is too high. And he did a study that compared unshod African runners to shod American runners. Okay, that's interesting enough, and that was uniformly picked up by the media. It was uniformly put forward as the reason that you should run barefoot or minimalist. However, there's a very interesting study that has come out very recently. So this is from Kevin Hatala and co-workers, and this is from 2013, so it's very, very current. And they did a similar study to Liebman. What they did is they took 38 habitually unshod runners in Africa, and they looked at their strike patterns. They found the majority of subjects used a rear foot strike and endurance running speeds. Now, this has shocked the world. Literally, this has been a big upheaval because it is in direct contradiction to Liebman. And it is actually saying, well, you know what, just because you run barefoot doesn't mean that you're going to be on your forefoot or your midfoot, and all those perceived benefits of being on your forefoot or midfoot may not necessarily be there. So it's kind of quite interesting. They said that the percentages of midfoot and forefoot strike increases significantly with speed, and they also said that not all habitually barefoot people prefer running with forefoot strike. Now they then went on to make some interesting statements which, in retrospect, are blindingly obvious. So they also said that there are other factors at play here, and these factors include how fast you run. It includes what your training level is, how hard you train. It includes the substrate mechanical properties. In other words, we know that the surface you run on will automatically modulate the way you run. Okay, so the brain perceives that the hardness of the material, your lower limb stiffness changes, and you will then change the way you run. So that's very, very important. Running distance is very important, and running frequency influences the selection of foot strike patterns. Now, all these things are incredibly obvious. We should have been discussing this a long time ago, but we haven't. So that's quite interesting. So when we think of it that way, I've got a question to ask this group, and I hope you'll entertain me by just with a show of hands. Who here can run 100 metres in 15 seconds? No, okay, I want to know who can run now. So we've got 1, 2 people, 3 people. Okay, so we've got 3 pretty good sprinters here. Well, that's pretty interesting. These guys are better than this fellow, okay? This is, this Bakili. He can't do that. He can only run 100 metres in 15.6 seconds, so he sucks basically. But he can do it every 100 metres for 10 kilometres, okay? If we have a look at Patrick Mutai, he also sucks because he can only do it in 17.5 seconds, but he can do it every 100 metres for 42.2 kilometres, okay? So this is where the concept of pointing at an athlete and saying, that guy's on his forefoot, therefore that's the way I should run, is not comparing eggs with eggs. These guys are exceptional, extraordinary athletes. Okay? These guys may midfoot strike or they may forefoot strike, but they're essentially sprinting the entire time. Okay? They're running very, very fast. And of course we know the mechanics between walk, jog, run are entirely different. So, I think this is a discussion that's been right in front of us that we're just not having it, and it's a pretty logical argument. So if we expand this and have a look at which is best, barefoot and forefoot, well, we can probably take some pretty good information from the 2012 US Olympic 10,000 metre trials, right? So we would assume that 10,000 metres, these guys are going very fast. We would assume that the best 10,000 metre runners in the USA are all going to be up on their midfoot or their forefoot, correct? Now I hope you can see this, but we've got some pretty good runners here. Galen Rupp's right up the top here. If you have a look at this here, so this is the photography of all of these athletes. There's actually 20 of them, I couldn't fit them all in here. You'll see that there is zero uniformity in terms of their foot strike pattern. So some strike on their midfoot, some strike on their forefoot, some strike on their rear foot, and some do one thing on one foot and something on the other foot. Okay? So there is no uniform pattern. There is no one true way. Anybody who's telling you that, I think is not understanding what's going on. So this brings us into the discussion of form, and form is really interesting. I like to think of myself as a bit of a student of form. Can anybody see what's going on here in terms of form with this fantastic, I've actually been to Bowling Green in the USA, in Ohio. Can anybody see what's very unusual on this particular slide in terms of form? We haven't got enough time to throw it around, but I can tell you the unusual thing is that this fellow here is wearing a beret, which I think is incredibly good form to running. If he had a cravat, that cravat would have been even more impressive. So, form is kind of an interesting topic to discuss. Again, we've got some assumptions that are being made here about form, and in fact there are people out there who are teaching good form or teaching perfect form. I do have some issues with that. So this concept that somehow there is such a thing as perfect form is fatally flawed, and that you should be teaching a particular form to all runners is fatally flawed. I think that to assume that this is going to directly impact on injury has some major issues. There are some form errors that everybody agrees are bad. Simple example is overstriding. Overstriding, everybody agrees, is a bad thing for an athlete. Everybody knows that that's going to increase the braking load, and that's going to be an issue. But we don't want to be throwing a blanket over everything. This is interesting. This is Tika Galana for she's the Olympic gold medalist in London. Tika has been severely beaten with the bad form baton. If you watch her run, she's arms and legs all over the place. She's by no means a classical distance runner, but in July of last year, she was the best women's marathon runner in the world, and she won the Olympic gold medal. Okay? So you can have great variations in form and still be a very effective and very efficient runner. So what are we doing here? What are we telling people? What are we dealing with? Well, I think the most important lesson in relation to running form is you've got to be extremely careful about changing things, and especially you've got to be extremely careful about changing things with recreational runners. A recreational runner is not the same as an elite athlete. Okay, elite athletes have benefits of all sorts of input that recreational runners simply don't have. So if somebody comes and says, I'm going to suddenly change the way I run, or I'm suddenly going to change the shoe I'm wearing, I would advise you guys to caution them and say, you are setting yourself up for a problem there, and you're probably begging from injury, so you've got to be very careful about large-scale change. Forefoot versus rear foot, what does the literature tell us here? There's a couple of good studies. I'm not going to bore you too much with this. These are the classics. There's 3 of them. This is Hasegawa from 2007. He looked at 283 elite runners in a Japanese half marathon, and they looked at the 9.3 mile mark. You can see here that they found 75% rear foot striking, 24% midfoot striking, 1% forefoot striking. Okay, that ties up pretty closely with Pete Larson's study from 2011. Pete Larson looked at a very interesting study. He looked at them at the 10K and the 10K and the 20K mark in a marathon. He found quite similar figures here, about 90% rear foot, 3% midfoot, 2% forefoot, and 6% completely asymmetrical. He also found that at the 20K mark, those runners that were running on their forefoot were then running on their heel, and he stated in his paper, presumably because of fatigue. The final study, the most recent one here, is from last year. This is from Casper and co-workers, a huge cohort, almost 2,000 runners. Of those runners, 1,865 were heel striking. Okay, so well, no matter what you think, the vast majority of runners, for whatever reason, still heel strike. Okay, and we need to sort of factor that into the injury thing. So if we talk about injury, what does the literature tell us? Well, there's not much injury data, I have to tell you, but not much good injury data at all. There's very few very good studies in this area. But if we look at the ones that are out there, this is from Pioneers 2003. They looked at 471 runners. They found no differences between rear foot and forefoot strikers concerning the frequency of injury. Walters and co-workers, 1,203 runners, no differences in incidence of injury between rear foot and forefoot strikers. However, the location and kind of injury complaints are different. The only study is quite recent. This is from Daoud and co-workers from last year. One of the co-authors was Daniel Liebman. They looked at 52 almost elite level runners in a retrospective study, and they stated in their study that heel strikers were twice as likely to develop injuries as midfoot or forefoot strikers. Is that really true? Is that what the paper said? Well, I cross swords with these guys all the time. This is a place called the Natural Running Centre, and basically these guys are members of the Evangelical Church of Barefoot Running. This is what they said on their website. New study examines forefoot striking versus rear foot striking. Guess which runners get injured more often? They then went and underlined and said those who habitually rear foot strike had approximately twice the rate of repetitive stress injuries than individuals who habitually forefoot strike. This finding, the first to associate heel striking with injury, is likely to fuel the continuing debate about whether barefoot running is better. Okay, so what did the study really say? And keep in mind this was funded by Vigram. Well, what it really said is that barefoot running wasn't included, so why the hell are they talking about barefoot running? It wasn't a part of the study. It found that when we look at the injuries, they looked at medial tibial stress syndrome, no differences, knee pain, no differences, ITD, no differences, bench stress fractures, no differences, tibial stress fractures, no differences, two-place tendinopathy, no differences. Achilles tendinopathy more in forefoot strikers than females, but not in males. Plantar fasciitis more in rear foot strikers than females, but not males. Hip pain, which was not defined, more in rear foot strikers. Repetitive joint strain, not defined, more in rear foot strikers. The summation of this was they looked at 23 running injury types and they categorised them in 16 forefoot striking and 36 rear foot striking athletes. Keep in mind, we've just said that about 90% of all strikers are rear foot strikers. 30% in this study were forefoot strikers, so the data's skewed. So they chose their cohort. What they actually found is that 2 of 23 running injury types showed a slight significant difference between the forefoot striking and rear foot striking runners. In 21 of 23, there was absolutely no difference. And as I said, the hip pain and repetitive joint injuries were not defined. And predictably, what happened on the basis of this research, one particular company that builds the so-called ubiquitous barefoot shoe posted this as their major advertisement. It's official, barefoot is best, and if you're a skilled barefoot runner, you're going to have at least half the likelihood of injury than if you wear a shoe, a rear foot striker. That is simply not what the research found. So it's a major manipulation of that. Minimalist, finally, this is my final comment on this. This is from Joe Hamill, very well respected scientist out of the out of the University of Massachusetts. Findings do not indicate that running with or without shoes or with a particular football pattern is beneficial for injury. I'm going to spend about 1 minute on the future now. My conclusion is that I don't think there is a magic bullet. I don't think it's barefoot, I don't think it's minimalist, I don't think it's traditional running shoes. And the question is, where do we go to here? 4 quick questions to be answered. And this is strictly my personal view because Mark Doherty's in the audience and he'll throw stuff at me. These are the questions I'd like to just briefly answer. Have the technologies delivered by the mainstream athletic footwear companies been based on science? Do we believe in cushioning? Do we believe in motion control? And does the whole categorisation of footwear need to be overhauled? Let's take them one by one. First of all, have the technologies that have been delivered, have they been based on science, on real science? Well, the answer to that question is they've been based on the science of the day, but they're not based on the science of today. And a lot of the technology is 30 years or more older. Therefore, I'd say, for the most part, they're irrelevant, and we definitely need to be moving on. What about cushioning? Do we believe in cushioning? Well, that kind of depends. We know that cushioning does things like it attenuates shock pretty well. We know it attenuates pressure, it changes accelerations, but it adds weight, and weight is the great enemy of runners. So we've really got to try to figure out this balance between what an athlete needs in terms of cushioning, how it affects things like loading rates, whether the impact peak is important or not. We've got to start working a little bit more on this. What about motion control? Well, a few of you might have heard me talking on this over the years, and a few of you know a doubt about my view on this. Motion control in footwear, as with athletic therapy, you can't control motion. It's just not possible. Virtually none of the current research supports the concept of motion control. Therefore, as a category, motion control has to be abandoned, and it should have been abandoned years ago. So finally, does the whole categorisation of footwear need to be overhauled? I think it absolutely does. I think it's meaningless at the moment. We've got a whole lot of categorisation that you cannot, in a research sense, possibly match. So you can't actually take a foot type at the moment and match it to a motion control shoe and have any confidence that that's actually going to work. So we do have to overhaul. Mark Doherty showed me a very interesting thing this morning, a new system he's come up with that makes a lot more sense to me, and it's a weight scale versus comfort algorithm. So it's the same with barefoot though, so we can't really say with accuracy that anything is perfect. Alrighty, so that's it. I think this is the final word. This is something I read on the internet quite recently. How the foot lands and the mechanics of the lower limb change the data sets to a much larger degree than any cushioning or shoe manipulation. As a result, foot mechanics should be the most important thing to study, with shoe manipulations of secondary importance. And the future is going to be about how shoes change joint angles, velocities, and moments. And I really do think that's where we're going. This is from Steve Magnus, who runs a very good blog. He's a very esteemed coach, so he's worth reading. Alright, that's it. If you want to check that out, as I said, you can go on the website and have a look at it. I hope that's given you a bit of food for thought, and thank you very much for listening.